Good afternoon. Welcome back, everyone. So next up, we've got Curtis Maloney, who will be speaking about a quick introduction to AWS Serverless. I'm quite intrigued. Curtis has been working with Python since the late 90s, starting with 1.5. And in the interim, he's used everything from web services, payment gateways, access control systems. He's used it for everything and just mucking about. So please welcome Curtis.
Hi, first up, sorry about the very rough nature of this talk. I wrote it over the last couple of days to help fill in for a gap in the schedule. So that's my excuse and I'm sticking to it. Right, so hands up anyone who knows, well, firstly, I got nothing to do with them. They don't pay me, they don't reward me, I just use their free stuff like everybody else does. Anyone here have any experience with AWS's serverless technology? Okay. I've been playing around with it for the last few weeks. Actually, it must be longer than that because I gave a talk about it at Mel Django last month. And I'm finding it very, very promising for a number of reasons, which I'll start covering during the talk. So, firstly, what is it? Well, you take AWS Lambda. Anyone here know what AWS Lambda is? Good, most of you. Okay, it's an ability in AWS to write a function in Java or Python or Node and have it run when certain events happen. And then you can basically script up reactions to stuff on your server. Combining that with AWS API Gateway, which allows you to create RESTful gateways that then bind through to other things in AWS's infrastructure. And this gives you ops-free scaling. Who likes the idea of zero-effort scaling? Come on, you all do. So what's Lambda? As I said, functions in Python or Node or Java, we'll not hear about the other two, triggered by events in AWS, so it might be that as a server starts up or somebody sends a message or a message appears in a queue or the day changes, there's all kinds of things, and you can even have periodic ones. Originally there for automating reactions, but it's auto-scaling. So AWS will manage firing up a box and running your code on it and keeping it around for a while just in case you decide to do that again and throwing it out. And if you start running it a lot of times, they'll run up a lot of boxes for you. This sounds easy. What's API Gateway? So you get a RESTful API front end that you can then adaptively bind to all kinds of things. So you might want it to serve a file out of S3. You might want it to make a database query to DynamoDB and hand back the results. You might want it to who knows what else. It's also auto-scaling. You just get charged by the request and the amount of data you send, and it can talk to Lambda. So now we have our recipe. We can go straight from a web request, map that information to our function, have the information come back, and send that back to the client. Well, that's a web application. So I'm going to do the crazy stuff of live demo right here in front of you. First, the window doesn't go anywhere. Whew. I have problems with scaling sometimes. Problems with a high DPI monitor and a not high DPI everything else. So, why do you split there? Come on, full screen. So AWS provides a lot of services, as you can see here, lots and lots of opportunities. But let's go have a look at Lambda. I've already got a bunch of stuff I've been working on. Here's the very first one I wrote, which is a Lambda handler that returns the current date or time, date and time. And if you ask it to mock it, it returns a known date and time. We can test this. Go on, run it. And down here it shows us we've got some output, which is somewhere around about now. Doesn't seem like a lot of use, but I actually have a client who needs this. Not going into why, but there it is. And that means I don't have to worry about this ever again. Because they've got this function. It's there. Amazon will make it work forever, as heavily as they hit it, which would be once or 6 times a day or whatever. But how do we actually create our own new function? Let's do this from scratch. Let's create a Lambda function. They've got a whole lot of templates there for you if you're into that sort of thing. We're going to do this the hard way. I've never worked out what this step is for because I've never needed it. But that's basically hooking up what triggers you want to fire this Lambda. I'm going to call it PyConAU, description, live. We'll pick our language of preference. Sorry, mistyped there. Now, you have a choice of editing the code in line in this lovely little editor down here, which I think is using CodeMirror or the basis of Atom or one of those. It's quite nice. Uploading a zip file so you can take all your source code, zip it up, and just send it there. And so you can actually access other modules and so on as you're going along. Or uploading stuff from Amazon S3, because we all store our files on S3, don't we? Okay. This is the function to call inside our module. Let's just choose an existing role I have of that one, which is an IAM role. So you can run it in control. You get to allocate how much memory, and this is important later on, as I'll explain, and even can run it inside a virtual private cloud to make sure it's really isolated from the rest of the outside world, if you want to be careful. Are you really sure? Yep, I'm sure. Let's test this. Do I want to pass it any parameters? We'll just, yep. And hello, there's our output. So what happens here is the context is a bunch of information about what's going on, where did the request come from, what version of things is going on, what server you're running on, a whole bunch of useful context information. The event is information about what happened to trigger this invocation. This is useful a little later on. So that's creating a very simple Lambda function. As we saw from my timestamp example, doesn't take much, and here I'm actually getting some information out of there. Okay, API Gateway is much more complicated because it can do an awful lot more. I have a little test area here where I've been playing with things. Let me just delete the whole API. Create a new API called test for Py. That's a text box, people. Is this at all readable to anyone down there? Yep. Good. Okay, so the first thing, we have a route that's been created, or a resource automatically created for us, the root resource. We can create a new resource. Let's call it hello, and that gets put under /hello. On this resource, we're going to create a method called get. Here it is, and we're going to do a Lambda function, but if we wanted, we could do any sort of AWS service in any AWS region that we wanted. We can proxy to other HTTP services, and we can do a mock integration, which is useful if you need to do options headers for cores, but that's all handled automatically for you if you ask them to. I'm down here in Southeast 2. Lots of autocomplete here just to make your life easier. Warning that it's going to give access to this from the API gateway, so just keeping you aware that you're opening yourself up. And this is what it's set up. The method request is how it takes the information from the web request and what it's going to do with it, how it's going to make it available to your whatever you're integrating with. The integration request allows you to take that information and then reformat it to make sense to whatever you're passing it off to. So for an example, if you were going to pass this through to a DynamoDB, you would have to take the query that you were given and turn it into an actual Dynamo query or an SQL query or whatever else you're going to use to pass it on. Then there's the Lambda, which is the thing we're actually going to invoke. Integration response allows you to do reverse. You get to reformat the response and hand it on, and the method response allows you to turn out how that gets mapped into an HTTP response. So let's have a look. Do we need authorization? So we can actually change that to require an IAM login if we want, but we're not going to do that. Are there any query string arguments that we want a special interest to? And this will help make them available to us more easily in our event. Are there any headers that we want to pass through, which I'll address that a little later on. And do we want to do any special work with content types? Now there is, down the list of options, there's a thing called models, where you can use the JSON schema system to describe data shapes that you actually want to use. And this can be applied to information coming in and going out to make sure it's all valid and correctly formatted before your code gets invoked. This way you add an extra layer of protection to stop you getting bad data in or out. And this allows you to map that by content type, so that depending on what the request says its data shape is, you can then go and map it out accordingly. Next, we have the integration request, which we've said we're going to a Lambda function. It's this one. And again, we get some body mapping checks. You can ask for it to pass the body through directly. We're going to address that later on when we try a little trick. Call the Lambda, integration response. We get to say, okay, by default, we're going to give a 200 response. There's a way to say, I want to match on specific error messages if your response is not a 200, or if you want your 200 to respond to an exception. It's actually easier to control that in Node, which allows you two different callbacks to return the response, whereas in Python, you either return your response or you raise an exception. I think this is a bit of a limitation, but it's the way it's implemented. There's nothing we can change yet. There's header mappings, which allow you to say, okay, this field of information that I'm returning, I want to put it into the header, this header. This I've used only for two different things. One is for redirections and one is for setting cookies, which I'll show you a little later on, I hope, if I have time. And finally, a body mapper, which allows you to say, how am I going to translate what my function returns into something that I can actually send across the wire? And by default, it's just send back exactly what you gave it, which is typically JSON, and then gets serialized and returned. So let's give it a test. I haven't said there's any headers or query strings of interest, no staging variables to help test it out, so I'm going to test it. And we get our response, and some headers, and an execution log. Wow, stuff happened. Lots of stuff happened, but we get told all about it. Have I just made an API? Yes, but nobody can get at it. So in order to do that, for all of you to start costing me money, I have to deploy my API. And to do that, I have to create a deployment stage. Let's call it dev, which is development. And why am I deploying? Because you all want to use stuff. And now I have an actual URL. I can go to that URL and it'll tell me, rack off, because that URL is for the base of the API. What did I call it? Hello? Hello. Anyone who wants to actually try and type in that URL can do that now. And well, Will it cost me? We'll get to that. So I can add other actions, I can add other methods, I can put a post method on here, I can put options and delete and all the rest of it, and have that run through and do whatever I need. Every now and again, of course, a lot of the times you want to do something and then redirect somebody elsewhere. So I'm going to turn this into a redirection function. In our method response, first we have to delete the old one, because you cannot change the status code without deleting and creating a new one. I'm going to add a 303. You can't hit enter, you have to hit the tick. I'm going to add a header, which is location. Okay. In our integration response, just as a test, well, I have to get rid of that because that doesn't exist anymore. Add an integration response to go to our 303. Now I'm going to set this and say we have a header mapping. Now we have the option to set how do I tell it what our header location is. So I'm going to edit that and say you're going to put in the string literal of that's a good place. It's very picky, you have to use the right quotes. It does matter. Okay, so that's saved, that's all there. Who expects this to work? Anyone? No? 3 of you? 3, 4 of you? You're all wrong. It's not going to work. What didn't I do? I didn't deploy. So you can go around, you can experiment, you can test. You can fiddle with stuff. I can test it here. Test, and what do I get? I get content type and a location header. That's what I wanted to see. Now, deploy into dev. What happened? The redirection worked. The site I sent this to doesn't exist, but the redirection worked. It took a while because it had to filter through all the stuff that AWS is doing for you. There's a hair on the screen. All right, so I can redirect, but I want to control where I redirect to. So, back to our little test function. What are we saying it is? That? So I'm going to return this, save and test. Okay, worked. I'm going to go back to the gateway, and I'm going to say in our integration response, don't put this literal. Let me use your fancy JavaScript looking but not quite template language and just say integration response body location. So I'm coming from the integration, I'm getting whatever it sent me as a response, I'm getting the body property of that, and inside that we stuffed something called location. Deploy. So that's how I can send a response back, but what if I want to get more information from the request? I have a couple of options. One is to get the information from the headers, one is to get the information from them. So what they do helpfully in your integration request, let's add just by default, it's application JSON because this is made for. So now they have this pre-cooked script here to do a lot of work for you. So what this is doing is you've got an object called $input, which is everything that's been passed to you, and you can grab some information. So they're saying into the body, we're going to try and parse the body of the request as JSON and put that into this attribute called body JSON. Then we're going to create a list of params for each different type in there, and so what you get out of there is headers, query string, and something else we'll see in a minute. And then it's going to say, okay, I've got all this other context stuff that I'm going to tell you about, which is like what account you're running on, what version, what tags, what HTTP method was sent, are you in the deployed stage or dev stage, where did they come from, are they an authorized user, which unfortunately requires using Cognito, which isn't available in Australia yet. And save that. I'm going to change this to also just passes the event. Should have done this first. Get rid of that. Status code 2000 coming to you. That's all good. It is a little tedious, but there are shortcuts to this. Has anybody here worked with wrong save button? There is a, oh wow, 5 minutes already. There is a language for describing APIs, which is called, Graham, help me out. Swagger. You can use Swagger to describe all your APIs and integrations for this stuff. Obviously, I'm running out of time. I completely misjudged how long any of this would take. I honestly thought I'd be struggling to fill the discussion. Nothing. We got nothing because I did it all wrong. Come and see me later. I'll show you how to do it properly. So, what does it cost? Well, Lambda free tier includes 1 million free requests a month. 400 gigabyte seconds of compute time. So what happens is the amount of memory you allocate to the Lambda multiplied by the time it runs for is your gigabyte seconds. 400,000 gigabyte seconds is quite a lot. But they round up all your time usage to the nearest 100 milliseconds. So, for example, the 100 millisecond or the 40-odd millisecond request that you make that takes 128 meg of RAM, because that's the least you can use, has just cost you 12.8 megabyte seconds. And it's going to take you a long time to rack up 400 gigabyte seconds. And it keeps going forever. This is not a 12-month thing like some of the other free tier stuff. After that, it costs you 20 cents per million requests. It is cheap. And point stuff all per gigabyte second after that. I mean, that's absurd. So that's not really going to, by the time that starts costing you something, you're not going to care, I suspect. API gateway, you only pay, this is a quote from their payment stage, you only pay when you use the APIs when they're in use, so when something's actually calling it. There's no minimum fee, no commitments. You pay for the number of calls and the amount of data transferred, and you get $1 million per month free for the first 12 months, $3.50 per million API calls received, and 9 cents per gigabyte for the first 10 terabytes of data. So I really wouldn't worry about it. Yeah, any questions?
Okay, we'll only have time for one or two, so.
What about this thing called Zapper?
Right, well, yes, I should talk about that. There is Zapper and there is Chalice. So two mobs, one inside AWS and one outside, have gone and said, hey, we can do this and we can make it happy for all the Python people. Zapper is a solution for publishing WSGI apps through this, and it automates an awful lot of it. Chalice gives you a much more low-level Flask-like solution. And again, you just say, deploy my app, and up it goes, and creates it all and pushes it and does all the authorization and everything and makes it very easy. The problem that all of these solutions suffer from is that if you leave it alone for a while, your Lambda app gets spun down and has to be spun up again, which isn't such a problem when you've got tiny little functions, which mine, I've measured it taking maybe 2 seconds to spin up. But if that matters to you, you can set up a periodic task to go and refresh and request it every 5 minutes to make sure it's hot. Any other questions?
Please tell me there's some way to set this thing up without all this tedious web
Yes.
GUI nonsense.
Yes, there is. As I was saying, you can write it up in Swagger. They cover it quite deep. In fact, the documentation almost, really heavily relies on using Swagger to describe how to bind all this stuff together and do it instead of doing it manually. So you can, if you're managing stuff on a larger scale, just describe it in Swagger and go, that's what I want. And I'm planning on moving a lot more of my stuff over to doing that as well, but I haven't got to that stage yet. More questions? Oh, more.
Did you play around with deploying $Python Web Framework on Lambda and getting that to work?
Sorry, with playing with?
$Web Framework, as in whatever web framework you want to use from the Python world.
I did try out using Chalice, and it was very easy, but very immature at the time I was using it. They've improved it, but it's still getting there. It's still very young. I haven't tried anything further. If I wanted to do anything further, it would probably have to...
And I think we'll just take one last question.
Yep.
Are you able to adjust the request coming in via Lambda to return different objects if it's a mobile, if it's a Mac, if it's Windows, and so on? Mobile desktop in particular.
I haven't looked to see how much information. I mean, you could pass in the headers and scan them to see what sort of device you're getting. The same no, you usually would, and then you just respond accordingly. You can get all the headers that you've got. So if that's what you want to check, I'm not sure how else you might want to check what.
Okay, I think this is the last question.
Yeah, kind of more just a comment as well, although I know we need to ask a question. It starts with what or why or how. But can you maybe just comment on persistence and storing state in these things? Because I know that's a bit of an issue and how some of the frameworks try and work around that.
All right. Well, since you have access to all of AWS, you have access to all of their databases. I've been using DynamoDB, which is their document store, key value store thing, and it's super fast. Now, Boto 3 is already installed for you, so you can get that and get access to all of their other stuff via that. So yeah, if you need persistence, they've got databases, they'll manage them for you. And Boto, DynamoDB is free for the first 25 gigs, and some stupid number of requests as usual, so yeah, not a problem.
Okay, can we thank Curtis for a great talk? Well done. Thank you.